And now we're coming to the final video on the news media. And in this one, I'm going to be talking about an experiment that I conducted with Professor Baum that was entitled In the Eye of the Beholder. It actually had a longer title than that. And it was published in the Quarterly Journal of Political Science. It is the only article I ever authored that was published in a scholarly journal. Not that that matters. So what I want to do is I want to describe the experiment that we did and why we did it. We were interested in this notion of the hostile media phenomenon, that people perceive balanced coverage, univalents perceive balanced coverage as hostile to their own perspective. But the media environment had changed tremendously since the original study was done. In the current environment, or actually this was done in early 2000, we were interested in whether or not simply knowing that a news outlet was on, a news report was on a particular outlet, would that shape people's perceptions of bias? And so we used sort of a similar approach that they used in the all sides chart that I showed you in a previous video. They just looked at online content and they looked at headlines. And that to me is problematic because headlines are by definition going to be biased because they're an attempt to attract attention. So we weren't going to go that same route. That wasn't our approach, but the idea of doing what they call a blind study, where people don't know which outlet is producing the news, we did that same thing. Although, as you'll see, we did it slightly differently. So let me explain the experiment. First, it was a national sample. We were fortunate that the National Science Foundation funded this, so it didn't cost us any money. So we were able to get a national sample just like they do in public opinion polls. And at the beginning of it, subjects didn't know that they were partaking in an experiment. It looked like they were being asked a bunch of questions about news consumption and about politics and things like that. At the very end, we had to let them know that they were participating in an experiment and what it was about. But in the beginning of the survey, they just thought they were taking a survey. And we asked them about whether they thought a whole bunch of media outlets had a liberal bias or a conservative bias or somewhere in between. Right, so we asked them about a bunch of outlets, but we were really only interested in what they thought about Fox and what they thought about CNN. Okay, one of the reasons that we had to ask about all the different media outlets is because you don't want to tip off people who are participating in an experiment what your experiment is about. So we asked them about ABC, NBC, CBS. We asked them about Good Morning America. We asked them about a bunch of different shows and whether they were very liberal, somewhat liberal, balanced, somewhat conservative, or very conservative. And we asked about a bunch of them. Now, one thing that's important to keep in mind is that around the time that this was done, around 2004, there were a surprisingly large number of people who said that CNN had a conservative bias. Now, that might seem very strange to you, but this was at the beginning of the war in Iraq. And a lot of people were complaining because they thought that CNN was cheerleading the Bush administration to go into Iraq. So it was a larger percentage than we expected, but there were a fair number of people who said that they thought CNN had a conservative bias. But that really doesn't matter. It's just an important historical oddity. Anyways. So the stimuli that we used was news coverage, transcript of news coverage of the 2004 presidential election. Now, unlike all sides, we didn't show them actual coverage. What I did is I went through a bunch of different transcripts of news coverage, and I picked out sections and made it work like one full broadcast because I wanted one full report because I wanted it to have certain attributes. I wanted it to be balanced, so there would be a positive thing about President Bush and a positive thing about John Kerry, his Democratic opponent. In some, it would just be President Bush. In some, it would just be Kerry. In some, it was negative about both candidates. In some of them, it was positive about both candidates. And we had 8 different sections. And so the way it would work is that the subjects would read the sections and then rate them. Now, here's the important variable in all this. After people completed the survey, they clicked on continue, and they all read the same transcript. But for some people, it looked like the transcript came from CNN. The names of the anchor, the person who heads the broadcast, was the anchor for CNN at the time. His name is Wolf Blitzer. For Fox News, it was the anchor for Fox News. And if you look on your screen, you'll see that they also could have gotten a news outlet called KNWZ, K-News. Now, if you've never heard of KNWZ, don't worry. We made it up. We wanted to have a news outlet that people didn't have any prior views about. Oftentimes this is referred to as like a placebo. They might have prior views on CNN, they might have prior views on Fox, but nobody was going to have prior views on KNWZ. And so when they read the transcript, we made sure that we put the logo for CNN at the top of the transcript when they were in the CNN condition. When they were seeing what they thought something was from Fox, we had the Fox logo, and we even created a KNWZ logo that we put the logo for KNWZ each time they did a rating, because we wanted the stimuli to be the exact same. The only thing that was different was the logo, whether you saw CNN, Fox, or KNWZ, and the names of the people who were doing the news, right? So it would either be the CNN anchor, the Fox anchor, and then for KNWZ, we just made up names. Actually, I used my neighbors' names. So when they clicked on continue, right, they would read something like this. This was the opening section they read. Good evening, and it would be the name of the anchor. Let me move this out of the way so you can see this. Good evening, I'm whoever it was, whether they were seeing CNN, Fox, or KNWZ. We start tonight with the presidential candidates on attack. Today, with just 13 days left in the campaign, John Kerry was explaining why he believes the president does not understand the problems of ordinary people, while for President Bush, the message was mostly about why Senator Kerry's plans will leave Americans worse off. And in this particular case, we coded this as something being negative, being said about John Kerry, right, that his plans will leave Americans worse off, and something negative being said about President Bush. He doesn't understand the problems of ordinary people. But that's what we thought when we were creating it. What we wanted to know is what people thought about this paragraph. And so after they read this section of the transcript, then they would be asked a question. The coverage of President Bush in the above section was, and they could click on 1 was very favorable, all the way to 7 was very unfavorable. And then after they did that, we would ask the coverage of Senator Kerry in the above section was, and it was the same rating. It went from 1 very favorable to 7 very unfavorable. Now, as I said before, in any kind of experiment, you can't know what the results are before you start your experiment, because if you know the results, you're not really doing science. And so this is how we decided we would interpret the results, right? And we did this before we got the results. If people thought coverage, because we made an effort to make, so there were 8 different sections that they read, we were going to take their total, right? And if overall they thought the coverage was either favorable to President Bush or unfavorable to John Kerry, then what they were seeing, because John Kerry, by the way, was a Democrat, and President Bush was a Republican, if they thought the coverage was favorable to President Bush or unfavorable to John Kerry, they were perceiving a conservative bias. if they thought the coverage was favorable to John Kerry or unfavorable to President Bush, they were seeing a liberal bias. So we already knew how we were going to interpret our results. We just now had to gather them and see what people saw. And that's because we knew that the coverage was balanced. What we wanted to know was, would people see bias when they expected to see bias? And this is what happened. Let me scroll down. Their prior beliefs shaped their perceptions of bias. If a subject thought CNN or Fox was liberal, and there weren't a lot of people who thought Fox was liberal, but if subjects thought CNN or Fox was liberal, they wound up thinking that there was a liberal bias in the media. If the subjects thought CNN or Fox was conservative in their earlier ratings, they thought that the coverage had a conservative bias. They were expecting to see bias, and they saw bias. But what about subjects who saw the KNWZ treatment, the KNWZ condition, where they had no priors? Remember, they're all reading the exact same transcript. The only thing that's different is the logo and the names of the reporters and the anchor. Subjects who sought the KNWZ transcript thought the coverage was balanced. Why? Because they didn't have any prior beliefs about KNWZ shaping their perceptions of bias. And so the implication is this: citizens create bias even when it's not present in the news. And that's the part of perceptions of bias that I want students to think about. I'll end this with a story. Back when I was teaching at Moore Park College, I had a student who was very conservative. She was very, very conservative. She wound up graduating from Moore Park, going to UCLA as what's called a Regents Scholar, which is like the top 2% of applicants. And then she wound up graduating from Harvard Law School. The student was brilliant, one of the most brilliant students I've ever had. She used to refer to the Los Angeles Times as the Democratic Times. She essentially said the Los Angeles Times was so liberally biased that it basically functioned as a wing of the Democratic Party. So I said to her, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send you a news report, and it's either going to be from the Los Angeles Times or it's going to be from the Washington Times. The Washington Times tends to have a conservative bias. Actually, I think if you look on the chart for all that All Sides did, it had the Washington Times as a conservative-leaning news outlet. I said it's either going to be from the Los Angeles Times or the Washington Times, but I'm not going to tell you which it was. And I sent it as a text document, so there was nothing on there to let her know where it came from. And I asked her to tell me whether it was from the Los Angeles Times or the Washington Times. When she got back to me, she said, I think it's from the Los Angeles Times. And she was right. Like I said, she was brilliant. But this is what she said. But as I was reading it, I realized that if I knew it was from the Los Angeles Times, I would have seen it as being wildly biased. I would have seen it as being very biased. But not knowing sort of tempered my interpretation of it. So she was smart, and she was also very intellectually honest. And that's what I'm going to suggest that you do. That when you're looking at the news and you're perceiving bias, ask yourself how much of that is you and how much of that is what's actually in the news. And I think if you take a good look at it, one of the things you'll realize, and one of the ways you can do that, is ask yourself, if I saw this news coverage, which you see as bias, on a station that you believe is balanced, would you view it differently? Because I think what you'll realize is that some of the bias that people see is their own bias being reflected back at them. Now, again, I'm not suggesting to you that the media doesn't have bias. There are bias outlets. The all sides chart makes that abundantly clear. It makes it abundantly clear that the idea that the media has a bias one way or the other is just nonsense. But the key is to figure out how bias. And what that means is you need to remove the part of the bias that's you. And then what's left over, that's the media. And with that, we are finally done with the news media videos. I'm sorry this was a little bit long, but it was my own study. Anyways,